All right, welcome to the Deep Dive, where we take a look at all those sources you've been wanting to check out but just haven't had the time for.
That's right. Today, you've pointed us towards a fascinating question, the biological mechanisms of aging, and you've given us 3 key papers to help us unpack it.
Exactly. We're going to be tackling aging through these 3 papers, starting off with that original publication on the hallmarks of aging by Lopez-Oten and colleagues from way back when.
Oh, yeah. The one that really set the stage,
Exactly. It really got people thinking about aging on that molecular level. But, of course, science moves fast. So then we're going to dive into their updated paper, which shows just how much the field has advanced.
And to round things off, we're going to be looking at a critical review of the whole hallmarks of aging framework from Gems and de Magalhães. Always good to get a different perspective.
Absolutely. Can't just take things at face value, right?
Wait.
So the big mission for this deep dive is to get a handle on those core concepts.
Right. What are these hallmarks all about?
How have they evolved? And crucially, what do some of the big names in the field think about their usefulness for aging research? Where do they stand in all of this?
Yeah, let's jump right in. Why don't we start with that original Hallmarks paper and set the scene a bit?
Sounds good to me. So take us back to the beginning. What was so groundbreaking about this paper?
Well, for one thing, it really tried to move away from this idea that aging is just, random damage building up over time.
Right, just kind of inevitable wear and tear.
Exactly. Instead, they argued that aging has these specific hallmarks, these underlying changes at the cellular and molecular level that happen pretty consistently, even across different organisms. I can't quite recall the exact title off the top of my head.
No worries. The details aren't as important as the big picture.
Right. What matters is that the paper laid out this initial group of key features that they saw as the real hallmarks of aging, a bold attempt to organize a really complex field.
And it definitely made a huge impact. A framework like that has driven so much research, hasn't it?
It really has. And of course, fast forward a decade or so, and Lopez-Oten and his team revisited those ideas. Which brings us to that updated Hallmarks paper. And things have evolved quite a bit, haven't they?
Oh, for sure. More than just a little tweak here and there.
Yeah.
So what's changed?
Well, first off, the list of hallmarks grew, went from 9 to 12.
Whoa, so 4 new entrants.
Yep. And they cover some really interesting areas, too. We've got genomic instability now, which basically means our DNA becomes more prone to mutations and other kinds of damage as we age.
So those little errors start creeping in more often.
Exactly. Then there's telomere attrition. Those protective caps at the ends of our chromosomes.
Yeah, I've heard they're like the aglets on shoelaces, keeping everything from unraveling.
Perfect analogy. So those telomeres, they shorten over time, and when they get too short, it can trigger cellular aging.
That makes sense. What else is on the list?
Well, there are epigenetic alterations, too. Those are changes to the instructions that tell our genes how to behave. But it's not about altering the DNA itself. Think of it like adding sticky notes to a book.
Yeah.
You're not changing the words, but you are changing how they're interpreted.
Intriguing. And, of course, we can't forget about proteostasis.
Ah, yes, loss of proteostasis. That's when the cell starts having trouble keeping its proteins folded correctly, all tangled up.
And that could lead to
aggregation. Those proteins start clumping together, forming those harmful deposits. Not a good sign.
Okay, that's 4 down and 8 to go. What other additions are we looking at in this updated framework?
Well, there's disabled macrophagy, which is basically the cell's garbage disposal system getting less efficient.
So less recycling.
Yeah, less breaking down those damaged components and cellular debris, which can really start to cause problems.
Mm-hmm.
Then there's deregulated nutrient sensing. This means cells become a bit clueless about what's going on with nutrient levels, which can mess up a lot of metabolic pathways.
They're not getting the right signals anymore.
Exactly. And then, of course, there's the issue of our cells' powerhouses, the mitochondria.
Ah, yes, mitochondrial dysfunction, right? Another classic sign of aging.
Sadly, yes. And we can't forget cellular senescence. That's when cells basically enter retirement. They stop dividing.
But it's not exactly a peaceful retirement, is it?
Nope. Those senescent cells can actually cause trouble. They release all sorts of inflammatory molecules and other factors that can affect nearby tissues. It's like a grumpy neighbor situation.
So we've covered 8 now, right? What are the final additions to round out those 12 hallmarks?
Well, we have stem cell exhaustion, which is just what it sounds like. Those stem cells, our body's repair and regeneration crew, they start to dwindle and become less effective over time. Then there's altered intercellular communication. As we age, the way our cells talk to each other changes. leading to more tissue dysfunction. It's like a communication breakdown.
Oh, I see. And that brings us to chronic inflammation, or inflammaging as it's often called.
Right, that low-grade, persistent inflammation throughout the body, which we know is linked to so many age-related diseases. And finally, we have dysbiosis, which points to imbalances in our microbial communities, especially in the gut. These can have ripple effects throughout the body.
So 12 interconnected hallmarks painting a much more detailed picture of aging than before.
It really does, doesn't it? And it's not just that the list is longer. The updated paper also sets out these much stricter criteria for what actually qualifies as a hallmark of aging. It's like they wanted to really solidify this framework.
And that makes a lot of sense. It's not enough to just say, oh, this thing changes as we age. So what are these criteria?
Well, first off, the hallmark has to be clearly linked to the aging process. It's got to be something that actually happens as we get older. And second, when you experimentally make that hallmark more prominent in an animal model, it should speed up aging.
Okay, so you're not just observing, you're actually manipulating things to see the effects.
Exactly. But maybe the most important criterion is the third one. If you intervene therapeutically, if you try to reduce or even reverse that hallmark, it should slow down, halt, or even reverse aspects of aging.
Now that's compelling. It's not just correlation. It's moving towards potential causation and treatment.
Exactly. Moving from this thing happens with age to this thing might be driving age. So these criteria really raise the bar for what can be considered a fundamental driver of aging.
Absolutely. Okay, so this expanded and refined list gives us a much more comprehensive view. But let's not forget that third paper. We need to see how these ideas are playing out in the wider scientific community. And that brings us to Jim's and the Magdalenes with their critical review. They really make us think about the whole idea of hallmarks in aging research, don't they?
They really do. They bring a new perspective. They start off by talking about Thomas Kuhn's ideas on scientific paradigms, those big frameworks that really shape how we understand things in a field.
Right. Sort of like the guiding principles.
Precisely. And their point is that biogerontology, while definitely making progress, might not have that truly unifying, super effective central paradigm yet.
Interesting. So they're saying that maybe the hallmarks aren't quite there yet.
Well, that's part of their argument. And they get into some really thought-provoking comparisons between the hallmarks of aging and the very established hallmarks of cancer. Highlighting some potential weaknesses or differences in how the concept is applied.
That's a good point. Cancer research does seem to have a more maybe solid foundation in that regard. So what kind of comparisons do they make?
One key point they bring up is this long-held assumption that cellular damage is like the root cause of aging. That idea that damage builds up over time, and that's what drives the whole process.
Right, it's a pretty common idea.
It is, but they point out that it's not a slam dunk. It's not definitively proven. They even mention some of the historical back and forths in the field, like the whole debate about the ROS theory, which focused on the role of reactive oxygen species. That went through a bit of a crisis, questioning how central ROS actually is to aging.
So it's not as simple as just damage equals aging.
Well, Jones and Demoglin suggest that there might be other, more fundamental factors in play. Maybe it's not just damage, but also program changes in our biology, things that are sort of built in.
That's fascinating. So they're not dismissing the role of damage, but suggesting there might be more to the story.
Exactly. And they have another interesting point, too. They argue that choosing those 12 specific hallmarks could be seen as a little bit, arbitrary.
Arbitrary.
Yeah. They suggest that there are other aspects of aging that could have just as easily made the list.
Okay, I'm curious. What kind of examples do they give?
They bring up things like antagonistic pleiotropy, which is where a gene might be good for us early in life, but then have detrimental effects later on. They also mention inflammaging, which we talked about that as a hallmark, but they see it more as a broad process rather than a specific thing. And then there's mechanical senescence, which is basically the wear and tear on our tissues over time.
Oh, and they bring up altered endocrine function, too, how our hormones change as we age. And even programmed changes, again, things that are driven by our genes in a more deliberate way. And they bring up dysbiosis again as well. It's interesting because they also mention how another group of researchers came up with what they call the 7 pillars of aging, and there's not perfect overlap between those lists. So if different groups of experts are proposing different sets of key features, does that suggest the field hasn't quite settled on what's truly fundamental?
That's precisely what Gems and Demoglin are getting at. They're suggesting that maybe we don't have that one definitive framework yet. They also question the whole distinction between primary and secondary causes of aging, how the hallmarks are categorized.
Because isn't that one of the key arguments in the Hallmarks paper?
It is, but Gems and Demegalines are saying that the evidence supporting those categories isn't always super strong. And they go on to say that even the links between those upstream causes and the hallmarks themselves, those causal connections, well, they aren't always fully proven either.
So how do we know that those upstream causes are really leading to those specific hallmarks?
Right. They're pushing us to think more critically about those connections.
And one of the things that stood out to me in their critique was how they address this issue of how those secondary and tertiary hallmarks actually contribute to the overall picture. How do they lead to the aging process itself, to age-related diseases, and ultimately to mortality? It's a big question, right?
Huge. And they highlight a very traditional viewpoint in biogerontology, which is that aging is separate from age-related diseases. The idea is that aging itself makes us more vulnerable to those diseases.
So it's like aging sets the stage, and then the diseases come along.
Right. But Gems and Demegalines challenge that separation. They suggest that maybe understanding the mechanisms of those age-related diseases is actually crucial to understanding aging itself, and they're concerned that the Hallmarks framework might not be capturing that interconnectedness.
So if I'm understanding correctly, they're not saying that the 12 hallmarks are irrelevant. It's more that they're questioning whether we should see them as the central paradigm for understanding aging.
That's a great way to put it. They're worried that, by drawing a parallel to the Hallmarks of Cancer framework, which is built on that solid foundation of genetic mutation, we might be giving the wrong impression. We might be suggesting that biogerontology has that same level of clarity, that we've got it all figured out.
But in their view, that's not necessarily the case.
Not yet, at least. They even use the term paradigmatic crisis to describe this situation, which is, a pretty strong statement.
It definitely gets your attention. So if they're pushing back on this hallmark-centric view, what are they suggesting instead? What kind of approach do they think would be more helpful for aging research?
They're really advocating for a more multifactorial view of aging. The idea is that aging is probably driven by multiple distinct primary mechanisms all working together, and that we need to acknowledge that complexity. It's not just one thing, it's many things. Kind of like how we understand most age-related diseases now.
We know that most diseases aren't caused by a single factor. It's usually a combination of things.
Right. And Gems and Demegalines think that's probably true for aging as well. And they even go so far as to propose alternative paradigms for how we might think about the field. They contrast this single primary mechanism idea, which is kind of what they see underlying the Hallmarks template, with models that have multiple primary drivers.
So instead of looking for that one big thing, we should be looking for multiple contributing factors.
Exactly. Like they bring up mechanical wear and tear, accumulation of molecular damage, pathogens, and the programmed action of our own genes. All of these could be playing a role.
So it's a much more nuanced and maybe a bit messier picture than a neat list of 12 hallmarks.
Exactly. They argue that embracing that messiness, that complexity, is important. And their overall assessment is that while the Hallmarks review is a useful overview, it might create a false sense of certainty. It might make people think we've got a clear explanatory paradigm when, in reality, we're still searching for those fundamental breakthroughs.
This has been an incredible journey through these papers. We started with the original attempt to define the hallmarks, saw how that's evolved over time, and then got this really valuable critical perspective that challenged some of the core assumptions.
It just goes to show how dynamic and complex the science of aging really is.
It really does.
Yeah.
And these kinds of discussions, these debates, they're crucial for pushing the field forward, for making sure we're asking the right questions, and really getting to the heart of what drives aging.
Couldn't agree more. It's about refining our understanding of this incredibly intricate process.
So as we wrap up, I want to put this back to our listeners. Thinking about everything we've discussed, what do you think is the best way forward? Should we be focusing on targeting those identified hallmarks, or should we be digging deeper, searching for those even more fundamental drivers of aging?
It's a big question, and a really important one to think about. It's not just about one approach or the other, but about evaluating the evidence, considering different models, and staying open to new ideas.
Couldn't have said it better myself. This deep dive has been a real eye-opener, and I hope our listeners feel the same way. We've explored how scientists have tried to define aging, how those definitions have changed, and how there's still so much we don't know. We encourage you to check out the papers yourselves, dive even deeper, and keep those questions coming.
And if you enjoyed this discussion, don't forget to like and subscribe.
That's right. We'll be back with more deep dives soon, exploring even more fascinating topics. Thanks for joining us.